Guru readings, we have the Masquerade of the Burning Carnival, Blighted solo push build. This is the Blighted Marrow Bone Spear push build where we are increasing our damage for each enemy that Bone Spear passes through. And granted, this particular variation I'm going to recommend is going to be a little bit more favorable to perhaps casual players, myself included. This is something that I have tested on the PTR, and I am going to tell you it's amazing to be so tanky as a necromancer, and I just want to highlight that in my particular push, solo push variation as well. It's just so fun to play. I mean, I know the pull mechanic from the Briggs, which is going to be featured and probably even might be a little bit more advantageous for pushing higher. It definitely has the weakness of you die a lot, and it can be very frustrating if you're like either a newer player or even if you're a seasoned player like myself, where you just don't like to die in a Greater Rift when you're pushing that much. This is going to be as good of a build you can get without having that mechanic in play, and there are some advantages that we can fit in because of this increased toughness, and it actually makes the build really manageable, really quick moving, and quick attacking. So this is going to be a super fun variation to run in season. Anyways, so let's get started. We're running again the Blighted Marrow rune, piercing enemies, but how we're going to line up enemies a little bit more is through our mobility in this build. And that's something I really wanted to highlight, is that if you have increased toughness by placing the unity in the build, you can then fit in different things to make the build a little bit more mobile. So something we're running here is the Lost Time, giving us 50% movement speed from our cold attacks. Our cold attack in this build is going to be Frost Scythe. Frost Scythe is pivotal, is a focus here for giving us both our mobility, restoring our essence per enemy hit, of course. So the larger of the pack that you swipe, you will get more essence returned, and that's going to be important for getting back into action and chunking out more spears as quick as possible. But also, the more enemies you hit, the more attack speed you get. So it's going to be very important there as well. We were able to push a Greater Rift 135 on the PTR. Granted, that was with the 500% or 6 times multiplier Gelmindors. This is the new item, by the way. They gave us a bracer with a multiplier on it. Very boring, very stupid, because they could have included this multiplier on Maltorius's and just put it there instead, you know, for example. It's really dumb. But we have these bracers now that instead of Nemesis Bracer, we're running these bracers, right? So giving us that multiplier increased in season. So the big thing for next season, the 4th cube, is going to be Reilena's, giving us about 9.3 Greater Rifts, I would say, thereabout, in increased potential. So that's the reason that this build will perform so well next season, whereas before it was not. We have the increased attack speed from the Frost Scythe, allowing you to attack faster, especially when your Convention of Elements comes around to the poison cycle. This will be heavily advantageous to have stacked up your Frost Scythe right before then. It will drop, and that's okay. It's kind of like a temporary bonus, temporary movement speed, temporary attack speed. You have to kind of use it in rotation, and when I'm saying rotation, because you're going to be also getting movement speed from Opportunist. So this isn't a rune that I've seen a lot of players use in push, but it's actually really advantageous with this particular build because we don't suck in enemies to line them up. Lining them up just by moving around and repositioning our character is going to be a focus of this build. So we have the movement speed from Lost Time and from Opportunist. We curse enemies, with Decrepify, we gain a 3% movement speed increase for every enemy cursed, up to a maximum of 30%. So you get 30% here, 50% here. You're actually moving quite quickly for a push build, especially with Blood Rush in the build. We're able to get increased armor from this Potency rune. And while you may be thinking, I might want to run metabolism to just get through the rift quicker, I would not do that, because on your higher end pushes, potency will be a factor for your toughness against those more difficult rift guardians, especially. I've noticed it really helps out in those scenarios. Other armor increases coming in, defensive increases coming in from standalone here, increasing our armor by 100%. The simulacrums, they don't count as pets, so you get the full 100% bonus. Notably, these armor increasing bonuses are based off of our regular armor amount, our base armor. They are being added in together. They are not multiplying on top of one another, they are adding together, right? So there's still huge increases, and it's still a nice toughness increase on both counts, but they're not going to be like game-changing in that manner, right? We also have a lot of toughness from the Dayntees binding. We're using a manual curse in this build, of course, so that's going to be quite nice. The 2-piece on the set will give us simulacrums all runes, and one of the simulacrum runes is, as you see here, curse form. While active, your curse skills now apply all 3 curses. Unfortunately, this doesn't yet apply to curse Scythe if you're using curse Scythe, not that we're using it in this build, but it will apply to the manually cast curses and frailty if you're applying curses in that way. So we get all 3 curses just from casting 1, which is going to be extremely important as well for survival through the Leech mechanic. And this hasn't changed since the last patch. It's still working the same. So we're getting the base rune of Leech when we cast our Decrepify on enemies. It curses the target area, healing the attacker for 2% of their total health when they are struck. Now, this doesn't sound like a lot, but how it's working, the mechanic, is that your simulacrums, when they hit a target, it's returning based on their health pool, not your health pool. It's actually a lot larger of a return than you would think for recovery. So recovery in this build is quite nice. If you're hitting enemies that are cursed, they will return tons of health to you. Now, how do we increase the benefit that we can get? How do we get more health returns from this build? Also, how do we make sure that our simulacrums aren't going to die as often? How do we make them more tough? Well, what you can do is stack more vitality in the build and more life percent. Those particular things will increase the health pool of your simulacrums, and therefore also increase the returns that you get when you hit cursed enemies from Leech. This is a very important interaction that you need to understand and take advantage of to excel in Greater Rifting, especially at lower Paragons, from a casual perspective. So you're going life percent on the chest piece, of course, life percent on the shoulders. Don't quite have room, unfortunately, to fit a lot of those affixes, but you're going to stack amethysts in the chest and pants and run a lot of Paragon in vitality to help us out here. Now, one of the things with this build that's kind of helpful is that when you die, when the Necromancer dies, you're able to recast because your simulacrum will be reset via the 2-piece as well. Cooldown is refreshed, so that is a nicety. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of cooldown in this build, so if your simulacrums start to die off before that cooldown is active, it sort of forces you to purposefully die, which can feel really bad. Another interaction is that with getting all the runes on simulacrum, we also get the self-sacrifice rune. If you would die with the simulacrum active, instead the simulacrums are destroyed. So what this is doing is if you take fatal damage, they will consume themselves and die off to keep you alive. But what this means, because the set has damage reduction, based on if your simulacrums are active, it means you lose a huge amount of damage reduction, because we have the 50% here, but we're also splitting it with our simulacrum, so it's a total of about 83% damage reduction. So it's a huge amount of toughness that we're getting from the set. And if they're not active, we're going to die anyway pretty quickly. So you kind of, because there's no UI element, that you can sort of see if your simulacrums are being killed off very readily. There is an icon in the top left corner of the screen, and the border of the skill is sometimes highlighted when they are active, but these things, in my experience, don't always tell you if they're alive or not. So you kind of have to just keep an eye out. If you notice they die, be quick to press this button. Sometimes that will save your life, other times not. Now, you may ask, well, Craddock, why aren't you running the final service passive that would proc ahead of your simulacrums sacrificing themselves, and therefore be able to much easily get through the rift? And that's because I was talking about earlier, there are a lot of things that we can do with the build that we can't do when we're equipping the Briggs Wrath for that pixel pool. Is that something we can do with the Unity, aside from getting the increased mobility, is replace this passive with a different passive. We're tough enough with the Unity that we can get increased damage from this fourth passive. So we're running this Serration for the increased damage at range, and you want to hit enemies at least 30 yards, I would think, to get full benefit of this. And then we're also running the Overwhelming Essence with the Reilena Shadow Hook, is going to increase your multiplier a little bit. It's about 11.5% damage, I think, from this one passive, as compared to the 20% you get from Serration at full distance, but it's still a nice increase of multiplier from the Reilenas that you get from here. Notably, on your weapons, plus maximum essence if you can, plus maximum essence as well in Paragon to benefit from the... Okay, okay, it's there now, so make sure you have those things, and yeah, you'll be able to deal more damage there. Dislocation for the stun. Notably, because we're running the Bone Prison here to help kill off a little bit more trash, the 3-second stun duration here is also really good against the Rift Guardian. So something I did against the Rift Guardian in the last few clears that I was doing on the PTR, pushing on the PTR, is I actually procced my Bone Armor before my poison cycle. I would go on the cycle that's after poison, and then by that time the Rift Guardian would have refreshed his crowd control reduction, so that any stun on him would go pretty much full duration, and then I would wait for the Bone Prison to proc during my poison cycle. So that's something you can test out, see if you like it, instead of having to use Dislocation on poison and then teleport out. You're wasting about at least half a second there just teleporting away, and then another half a second for your spears to travel to the target. So in reality, if you're using Dislocation, you only get like 1 second of stun, where you get the increased Crisman's sentence bonus on the Rift Guardian. So I've been kind of testing that out, and it actually works very well, which is why I really enjoy the Bone Prison for this build. It's just hugely advantageous for dealing increased damage with the Crismans to the elites, to the Rift Guardian. It's amazing, right? So we fit in this core of passives. These are the most advantageous passives that this build can fit in, and it's super cool that you can with the Unity again. Unity, of course, giving us Warn, the increased elite damage here, going to be very nice indeed as a bonus. Now, on the PTR, I ran with Unity rerolled to attack speed, so the crit hit damage here rerolled to attack speed. In an optimal scenario at higher Paragons, I think you can go with the crit hit damage here, and then you would bank on your Frost Scythe being out, because what happens here is, if you see on the attack speed, we're hitting the 31 frame breakpoint here, but that's only because of our Frost Scythe being ramped up fully. You see, even if we dip it down just a little bit, we're going to drop some frames, like even 1% from our Frost Scythe, and it's not optimal anymore. So if you're pushing as high as can be, you can go for the crit hit damage, but if you're a little bit behind that, or you just want to make sure that your attack speed is more consistent, you see here if I drop it all the way down. So basically with the crit hit damage on the Unity, you're gaining the most value out of your skill, but it also means you have to use the skill. If you don't use it and you don't stack it up to 15 before your Convention of Elements every time, you're actually losing damage. So if you want a more carefree setup, I would actually run the attack speed on the Unity, as I have done here in the 1.2k Paragons configuration, like I pushed with on the PTR. I wasn't as exact with those Grim Scythe, Frost Scythe ramp-ups before my cycle came around, and that's what I opted for. And you'll see here in this one, we're at a slightly higher frames, but the benefit is significantly lowered because with the attack speed on the ring, you jump from 35 to 33 anyway, and then with it ramped up, you go down to 30. So the benefit of your Frost Scythe, if you put the attack speed here, is less, but you have more consistent attack speed breakpoints and therefore do more damage during your Convention of Elements cycle. So that's just one thing, Affix-wise, that I was very interested to see. Lower Paragons, let's go over that first. So you're going to want to fit in Vitality on the Phylactery for toughness, again, increasing that base HP is going to be better at lower Paragons here. Bone Spear damage is going to be hugely impactful for your additive pool. There isn't really, to my knowledge, a lot of things in the additive pool, even though the display here is still saying that Maltorius is added in. It's fixed, it's now a multiplier. D3 Planner is apparently not displaying that correctly. Having Bone Spear on your boots, your phylactery, and your helmet going to be important, even at lower Paragons. Running the attack speed on the gloves, very important in my opinion, even at those lower Paragons. You can swap it around, so if you get a good ring with attack speed, but get the gloves with area damage, you can swap that affix as needed, right? And then the attack speed here on the Unity as well. Yeah. And anyway, Int can also be more advantageous at lower Paragons. So if you happen to get a weapon like this instead, that's very good. And higher Paragons, of course, percent damage going to be preferred over Int, over main stat. And then we get more space for area damage, but even at 2k Paragon, I would still keep the Vitality on the Phylactery. It's just a good base of toughness. You can swap out the main stat from your gloves if you want, in favor of more area damage to fit in there. The shoulder piece, so something here that's going on that's not really visible is because you're stacking all this attack speed, you're going to spend with the Scythe of the Cycle. See, it reduces the bone armor duration by 4 seconds, so we're spending our bone armor duration quicker when we have higher attack speed. So something we have to do to offset this is get higher resource to manage our resource costs, of course, and then also get slightly higher cooldown. And the cooldown was the important part for this particular setup. You're going to want the diamond in the helmet and then the cooldown on the shoulder piece, and that'll give you a good base up to 27% or thereabout to reset your bone armor a little bit quicker. And I noticed that I was able to spam my bone spear outside, even outside of rotation, quite a lot, and this helps for Strigan stacking. This helps for just generally dealing damage to trash, proccing Oculus rings that you can then teleport into right before your Convention of Elements cycle comes around. Going to be hugely advantageous in those ways as well. Let's see, the Razeth, I forgot to mention, but just make sure that you've spent a little bit of Essence and you're not topped off on Essence at any point, and you'll gain this damage reduction. Also very important for the build. Pretty standard in that slot for pushing, I think. Anyways, let's see. Higher Paragons, there is one setup that you can go for, and this is the Captain Crimson. So you might have seen a build that uses like Captain Crimsons and, you know, Invigoration, Perma, you know, immunity, but this is not that. We're just running the Captain Crimsons to gain the extra multiplier, gain a little bit of extra toughness, or rather replace our toughness, because you have to place the Ring of Royal Grandeur. You drop the Unity with this configuration, so you drop a lot of toughness, but what you get is more resource cost management. You get more resource cost reduction, which helps you spam the spears a little bit easier. You get more cooldown. It just means you have a little bit easier of a time when you're going through the rift and managing. You don't have to swipe enemies quite as often, which can be a downside because there's a more balanced rotation, in my opinion, when you're running the Unity. It's kind of like you're chunking your spears, and then as you start to run out of essence, you're like, oh, I need to reset my Frost Scythe. It's starting at that point, though. The Frost Scythe attack speed, its duration is only 5 seconds. You're starting to run out of essence at that point. Anyway, there's a lot of synergy. Your bone armor needs to be freshed at that point as well, so having to run back into melee range is still going to be a thing with this build. So even if you add higher paragons, you're running the crimsons, you'll still have to do that, and it gets a little bit harder to get used to with the crimsons. But running the crimsons here, giving us a little bit of extra multiplier, a little bit of extra resource cost management, but it is lower toughness. So I calculated at one point this particular variation with the Unity is, I don't know, about 30% tougher than the Captain Crimson's variation, but the Captain Crimson's variation does about 30% more damage. So you're going to take more damage, but you're going to do more damage, which is why I was saying this might be a better setup for higher paragons. And then, of course, I've included a Briggs build here, but you'd probably be better served looking at other content creators for the Briggs setup if you want that. But I would say try this out once you reach those higher paragons, see if you like it. I was dying a lot more, like extremely, so much more at those higher pushes, at like 135 plus. I was dying a lot when I tried out the Captain Crimsons. The Unity was much more favorable to me, and I'll probably stick with it even at those 2k plus paragons. I just enjoy this build so much. And I hope you do too. It's a fun build. It's going to be strong next season, and yeah. Thank you for watching.